Now I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Mark Lovern, Executive Director at Certara Strategic Consulting, who will introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Suzanne. It is my pleasure today to introduce Peter Bonnet and Stacy Tannenbaum. Many of us are aware of their accomplishments as pharmacometricians and modelers, but in particular, I'm very happy to introduce this talk because the topic is something very near and dear to my heart. Specifically, they've come to talk to us today about effective communication, which I think is the quintessential characteristic of any pharmacometrician. Whether we work in a pharma company or a consultancy company or even in academia, by definition, every pharmacometrician is a consultant. That is to say, we are primarily in the role of influencer rather than the primary decision maker with respect to pharmaceutical development. As such, the most important characteristic an effective pharmacometrician can have is not the ability to analyze data, but rather the ability to communicate effectively. With this in mind, both Stacy and Peter have made very substantive contributions to enabling pharmacometricians to communicate more effectively. Specifically, I recall the first ACOP meeting at which Stacy had introduced the keynote speaker, Edward Tufte, who did a marvelous presentation on how to effectively present evidence in a way that is both meaningful and impactful. And that particular talk has stuck with me over the years as one of the most memorable at any of the ACOP meetings. More recently, Peter has written and published a book on communication, specifically geared for modelers, called Be a Model Communicator, How to Sell Your Models to Anyone. And if you have not read the book, I highly recommend it, as I think it's an excellent treatise on how we can be more impactful in our work. Having, with this in mind, it's my pleasure to introduce Stacy and pass the floor to her to begin the talk.
Thank you. I'm just going to share my screen and we will get started. So can you see my screen, Mark? Oops.
Yep, we can see it.
Technology failure already. All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Pete and I are excited to give you this virtual presentation today on virtual presentations. And here's a picture of Pete and I doing the Japanese power pose. So what is speaking into the ether? Well, we work virtually in some way every day. Teleconferences, video conferences, instant messaging, phone calls, and emails. And with flexible schedules and working remotely, some of us may spend the majority of our day very productively, but not seeing or hearing our colleagues at all. So today our focus is going to be primarily on webinars, but a lot of the principles we're going to talk about today certainly apply to some of these other mediums. I think speaking into the ether is very tough. It's almost like presenting to an empty room. Engaging a virtual audience can be very difficult. So it's hard for you as the speaker to keep your energy high without getting any kind of feedback. And also, the audience knows you can't see them. So you're basically a disembodied voice. So for them, it feels easy to tune out and do other things. But we hope that this webinar will be a little bit different and that we can show some good practices for keeping a virtual audience engaged. So one of the things we're going to do is a little bit different. Usually the speaker assumes that the people on the other end are going to be paying attention, but we're not going to assume that. We're going to ask you to please give us your undivided attention. And this means no multitasking, folks. Put away your cell phones. Come on, do it. Close that document you were working on. Let your non-mem run just go. Respect your own learning goals. You chose to sign up for this webinar, so give us this 45 minutes to an hour and you're going to learn some new things. And respect our efforts as presenters as well. But in order to get you to agree to pay attention, obviously we have to give you something worthwhile in return. So it's quid pro quo. So let's answer one question. This is what the people want to know whenever they go to any kind of presentation. What's in it for me? Here's what we promise you today. An entertaining 45 minutes with world-class speakers. Is that enough? Maybe not, but wait, there's more. Our objectives today are, by the end of this virtual presentation, you will gain a better understanding of the challenges of virtual presentations and how to overcome them, find out the secret weapon you already have for virtual presentations, and learn some simple solutions to avoid or at least manage technology disasters. And of course, there's more. Now, we've asked you to pay attention, but we want to ask you to use the chat box. So this is something a little bit different. In a webinar, usually we don't hear anything from our listeners until the end of the presentation during Q&A. But part of a good webinar is keeping the virtual audience engaged. So we're going to ask you to go up into the right-hand corner of the screen and click that chat button, and add your comments, your thoughts, and your questions throughout the presentation. So Suzanne and either Pete or I will be monitoring the chat, whoever's not speaking, and we might pause to address something there. Now, it's an experiment. We don't know if it's going to be disruptive or not, but let's give it a shot. We want to try to take this opportunity to model some good behaviors. So to start, Pete and I are going to order pizza after this, but we can't agree on a topping. So everyone, please open the chat window and type in your favorite pizza topping to give us some ideas. We'll give you a few minutes to do that. Not a few minutes, a few seconds. Come on, take too long here. All right, there's a lot of comments that are coming through here. Really? Gosh. Well, it looks like the people have spoken, and Pete, unfortunately, we're going to be getting an anchovy and pineapple pizza for lunch. Thanks a lot, everybody. But obviously, as you see, it is very easy to use the chat window. So we're going to ask you throughout this presentation, please keep chiming in. Ask your questions, make your comments, and we'll be monitoring. Okay, so we've asked you to pay attention. We've given you an opportunity to give us feedback during the presentation, but if all else fails, consider bribery. It's really important when you're giving a webinar to keep their eyes on the slides. So you want to have something that will make them pay attention and not wander off to their email and wander off to their phones and start playing Candy Crush or Solitaire. So one of the things you could do is have a contest, a quiz, maybe some trivia at the end of your presentation based on what you presented. And make it a friendly competition. You want to give people bragging rights or perhaps cash and prizes. So in the spirit of practicing what we preach, we have a contest today because we want you to keep your eyes on our slides. Count the number of cats in this presentation. I've given you one already. Email your cat number and your mailing address to Peter Bonet at Astellas.com, and winners will receive a free signed copy of Pete's book. Now, there will be no cheating. They are going to be posting the slides within the next 24 hours, so you got to do it today. So count the number of cats, send us your number, and winners will receive a free copy of Pete's book. So we've asked you to pay attention. We've given you an opportunity for feedback during the presentation, and we've even bribed you to keep an eye on our slides. But I have a question for you, Pete, and be honest.
Yeah, Stacy, what is it?
Have you ever stopped paying attention in a virtual meeting and done other things?
Oh, have I? Let me tell you. In one survey, 90% of respondents admitted to doing other things during conference calls. And I got to admit, I think that number's probably a little low. I'm pretty sure every single one of us on the telephone has done other things at some point during a conference call or a webinar. In this survey, they asked the respondents, well, what did you do? People did things unrelated to work. They did email. They ate. They drove their car. They surfed the web, changed their clothes. And yes, I have to admit, I've done all of these things, including nap. I know at one 5 a.m. presentation with Japan, I accidentally fell asleep during the presentation. I admit it, not proud of it. My favorite one, though, was the person that actually flushed their toilet during a presentation. I guess they thought the topic was pretty crappy. So what's the biggest challenge facing virtual presentations? It's multitasking, right? We all do it. The question is why? Well, there's lots of reasons. You know, one is that we're impatient. The attention span of our society is getting shorter. We want rewards more immediately today than we did even 10 or 15 years ago. And so if we don't get that payoff in a presentation right away, that's it. We check out, we start to do other things that we will get that reward from. We're also busy. I don't know about you, but my life kind of looks like this figure on the right here. It is chaotic. And when I'm at work, it's actually hard for me to get work done because I'm constantly interrupted. People are coming into my office asking me questions. It's hard to do my work. So for me to sit in a webinar for an hour and give my undivided attention for an hour, it's hard to do. And not only that, I mean, my laptop's right in front of me. You know, the distraction is right there. It's so easy for me to just click and see what's going on in the news. And when I do it, when I do multitask during a webinar, I feel like I'm getting more done. Now, I know I've read the studies that show that multitasking isn't efficiently. Our brain doesn't process things at the same time. We have to switch back and forth, and yeah, I know, yada, yada, yada. But I feel like I'm getting more done. So that's why I do it. But I think really one of the biggest reasons people multitask is because the presentation is boring, right? We know within just a minute or two whether we're going to actually sit and watch this thing for 45 minutes or not. I mean, we can tell pretty quickly whether a presentation is going to go well or whether it's not going to go well. So what can you do about it? You have to be more interesting than the distractions. That's the bottom line. The material that you present, the way that you present it, you have to be more interesting than everything that's going on around them so that they want to pay attention to you and not to the other stuff. There's different ways you can do this. One is through your content, right? Get their attention immediately. When you start off your presentation, you've got to grab them, right? If you dilly-dally and you get to your conclusions at the end, people are going to lose interest. State your messages up front, right? Right at the beginning, say, look, here's what here are my conclusions. Now let me tell you how I got to these conclusions. And then go into your presentation, and you can show this slide at the end as well, so that if people do check out, at least they have a high-level overview of what you're going to be talking about. Too often, when we give our presentations, we treat them like a murder mystery, where we go through everything and we solve the murder at the end, or we give our conclusions at the end. That just won't work in today's society anymore. People want immediate reinforcement, so you have to get their attention right up front. You could also try some new and unusual graphs, right? I like this new library that came out in R a couple of weeks ago, scatter plots. It's basically a scatter plot with a cat as the marker, right? People, trust me, people will pay attention to that. And for purposes of the contest, this will count as one cat. The slide on the right here was developed for a fire science department. And what they did is they took their series plot and they overlaid it with some fire underneath it. And I just thought that was really cool. I mean, that's going to get people's attention. So if you try some interesting way to graph data, instead of the usual same old boring kind of thing, people will pay more attention to what you're doing. If you have a long presentation, you're going to have to break it up. You know, because typically what happens during a presentation, audience attention starts out pretty high. But as the talk starts to continue and as it gets longer and longer into the talk, audience attention will wane. And it's only towards the end of the talk, when people start to realize that you're coming to the end, that their attention starts to pick back up again. And what you want to do is you want to try and break up your talk so that the audience attention is more like a sine wave. It fluctuates between peaks and nadirs, and you don't have a high peak to trough ratio. I have to throw a little PK in there. Another way is to focus on your delivery, how you actually present the material, because it's not just about your slides. Your slides are important, but the way that you present your slides is also very important. But there are some challenges to the virtual presentation. As Stacy mentioned, there's often no visual or verbal cues. How do you build a connection with an audience? And of course, we have the dreaded technology and technical failures, and we're going to talk about each of these right now. In a typical communication cycle, you have two people. You have a sender and you have a receiver. And the sender sends some kind of communication packet to the receiver. The receiver takes that information and asks, did I understand that correctly? And they provide feedback to the sender, either verbally or in the form of nonverbal cues that convey that the information was received. But in a virtual presentation, you don't have this feedback. It's actually gone. So you feel like you're talking into space. You know, I'm standing here just talking into a phone, and if it weren't for Stacy being here, it would be very awkward. So you're left with no visual or verbal cues as to how you're actually doing during this presentation. You know, you like to think that the audience is paying attention to you, right? And so one thing that you can do is you can practice with a live audience before you give your talk, and you hope that they're paying attention to you. And then if but when in point of reality, they're more like this. You know, some of them are not paying attention, some of them are sleeping. You know, so if you practice with a live audience, you can tell whether or not they're smiling, whether or not they're confused, whether or not they're getting the jokes that you're saying. You can see what are the low points in your presentation. Where are people getting bored? Where are they starting to look tired or disengaged? And at those points, you can work to maybe try and re-energize your presentation. You can shake it up a bit, and you can try to, do different things to make those peaks and troughs maybe a little bit narrower. So, Stacy, let me ask you a question. When you're giving a virtual presentation, how do you connect with your audience?
Well, Pete, I think the first thing that you need to do is show them that there's a human being on the other end of the phone, and be yourself. People are a lot more likely to engage with someone who is real. And as you see, Pete and I are completely dorky. So if we tried too hard to be overly formal, you'd feel it. And you'd feel it wasn't authentic, and you'd start to check out. I mean, I think it also helps to remind people that there is an actual human being on the other end of the phone, not just a voice. So in smaller webinars, we really want to recommend that you consider having the video on, not only for the presenter, but even for some of the audience, so you can actually see the speaker. So instead of doing that here just for technology purposes, we know our limits, we decided to show some carefully curated representations of our personalities instead. But actually, if you think about tools for participant engagement, not only do they need to know that there's a person on the other end of the line, the personal touch, but there's also tools and technology for participant engagement. Webinars do not have to be a one-way street. So even if participants are muted, like you are, they can participate in the discussion real time. So they can use the chat box. And we're not getting a lot of chats, folks. Pick it up. And yes, Joan Korth-Bradley, I am getting Toastmasters credit for this. So one of the things you can do is use the chat box. Please use the chat box. We mean it. But if you're in your company, for example, and you have an instant messaging program, maybe you create a chat room that can be monitored. One of my colleagues used to do a lot of virtual presentations to her company, and they use Twitter a lot. So they would create a hashtag for every presentation, and somebody would be monitoring Twitter. So I just have one hashtag, possibility here. Feel free to use it. You can also do things like polls and surveys. You can do those both via your cell phone through text, or you could do them online. So there's a lot of opportunities to interact with the presentation, with the presenter and the audience during the presentation. But you have to tell people up front that they're going to be doing this. And this is why in the very beginning of the presentation we told you about the chat function. You want to alert participants ASAP if you expect their participation. And in particular, if you're going to be using a tool that's outside of your webinar platform, you want to include instructions in the confirmation email, and you want to give people an opportunity to try it so that they'll actually use it during the presentation. So one of the things you could consider is having some pre-work. So for example, maybe you want to do a quiz, maybe you want to do a survey that's very relevant to your presentation content. And what's nice about that is then you have a little bit of opportunity to gauge your audience, to know what they want to hear, and then you can work that into your actual presentation so people can see the relevance of interacting with the speaker before and during. If you are going to be using it during the presentation, what we ask is that participants are told to keep their phones or computers queued up to the right place. So if you have an online text, you may want to make sure that you have the text number already there. What we do is during the presentation, we monitor the tools. So in this particular case, I've been keeping an eye on the chat while Pete speaks and vice versa. So we want to make sure that if something does come up during the chat, that we're able to monitor it. So what are some benefits of not waiting to the end to hear from the audience? Well, we're all modelers. I presume most of the people that are on the phone are from modeling and simulation. And you've all been there. You go to a conference, you sit there, and you go, oh my gosh, I'm lost. You know, you get lost on slide 3. And once you're lost, you can't exactly interrupt and say, hey, I don't know what's going on, guys. You're gone. You're out of the presentation. You've lost interest. When you're in a webinar, I can't see your faces. So obviously this, you know, what we're talking about today, not rocket science, but if we were giving a very technical presentation and I saw your face looking confused, I might stop and say, you look confused. Is there anything that I can clear up before I move on? And if I do that, you're back into the presentation. But in a webinar where I can't see people's faces and I don't know if people are confused, I'm just going to power on. And you know what happens? We lose you. And that's something that we want to try to avoid. In addition, with things like the chat or with Twitter, what's interesting about that is that discussion may suggest a new direction for your presentation. It's a little hard to do in a presentation like this. Yes, you can chat just to us. We see your chat function. Unfortunately, there was a question that came up saying, are they supposed to chat just to us? Unfortunately, we can't share the chat with all of the presenters, with all of the participants. So please put your chats in the window and we will be monitoring it. Okay, so coming back to this, the discussion may set a new direction. So let's say you're presenting on topic A, but you mentioned something that starts off a chat, and what's going on in the chat window is very interesting. There's a lot of people that are chiming in. People are more interested in topic B, so move to topic B. Again, it's hard when you have a presentation like this where you have slides, but certainly in a more informal presentation, that's something that you could consider. There's also technology that you can increase just by your own slide set. So one of the things you could do is consider interactive or dynamic graphics. Usually we're used to seeing very static PowerPoint presentations. But with something like R-Shiny, which is a tool that's very popular right now within pharmacometrics, you can actually have interactive graphics where you can go in and say, well, here's what would happen if we doubled the dose, and it actually shows you what happens in real time. That's very engaging to an audience. But you don't just have to do graphs. You can do video or GIF files, any of those things that'll increase a little bit of movement on the slide. In addition, you can use your mouse or your on-screen pointer. So you can do right-click here to bring up this menu that you see here. But actually, we just discovered recently today, I don't know if you guys can see this on the bottom, but there is a transparent little menu on the bottom, and if you click on this thing that looks like a pen, you can choose the laser pointer. So you can use your mouse or your on-screen pointer, and I underline on-screen because if you're giving a presentation with multiple screens and you're using a regular laser pointer, people are only going to be able to see what you point at on the one screen. So please use an on-screen pointer. What I do ask is that people tend to do things like this. You know, keep chaotic pointer movement to a minimum, please. The other thing that you can do is consider annotation. Now, I say this is annotation on the fly. Obviously, this is already set up. But there are other things that you can do with annotation, like you can pick the pen and you can underline things. Just that amount of movement on the slide can pick people's minds up. And in addition, consider animation and movement to keep the audience awake. So I want to give one warning. Animation may not work in your webinar tool. So consider PowerPoint builds. Now, right now, I'm sharing my screen. But if Pete and I had uploaded our presentation, you would not have been able to see that cat run across the bottom because animations don't work. So the things that you can do is consider PowerPoint builds. So what you can see here is that this is actually several slides. Ooh. So you can see that this is actually the build goes like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 slides. It looks like one, but what you actually see is that it's actually a number of different slides. And so if you stack these slides on top of each other, it appears to be like animation.
Well, Stacy, these tools are certainly important, and these are all very good points, but I think you're forgetting one important thing, and that's you, right? The slides have the information, but you convey that information. You are the secret weapon for virtual presentations, right? You don't want to be the guy that just sits there and reads their slides word for word. we've all been there. We've all seen that, right? It puts us to sleep very quickly. It's not the way to present data. It's not the way to present information, right? You have the ability to spruce things up, to convey importance and keep that energy level high. And there's things that you can do to be better at that. And I'm going to tell you 3 right now. One is leverage your voice, right? Stand up. Stand up straight. I know it seems silly, but good posture makes for a good voice. Not only that, when you stand up straight, if you have a little bit of stage fright, standing up straight will give you more of a feeling of empowerment. When I give virtual presentations, I am always standing. Right now, I'm standing. Stacy is standing, right? Sitting at your desk, giving a virtual presentation is low energy. And like I said before, when you're doing virtual presentations, you want high energy to keep people enthused about what you're talking about. And by standing up, you get a nice, strong voice, and it also lets you speak from your diaphragm. And what I mean by that is that if you're sitting at your desk, your voice comes from your throat, your throat talking. But when you can stand up, you can access the muscles in your abdomen, and you can convey your voice in a stronger, more powerful way. And that will actually increase the energy of your presentation. The other thing that you can do is use a voice recorder. We've all got them on our phones. Smiling. Somebody just chatted in here. Smiling helps increase the energy as well. You're right, Joan. That's a very good idea. Thank you for pointing that out to us. Going back to this, use a voice recorder. We've all got these on our phones. Today, they're very easy to do. Practice giving your presentation into your voice recorder. Play it back for yourself. Listen to how you sound. And before the first time you do it, the first thing you're going to ask yourself is, do I really sound like that? And the answer is yes, you really do sound like that. Because when you are talking, right, your ears are actually getting vibrations from 2 different sources. Getting vibrations from your throat where you're speaking, and that vibration is going up through your head, but at the same time, you're getting the air vibrations coming in through your ears. So how you think you sound while you're talking is different than how you will think you sound when you're just listening to a voice recorder, because when you're listening to a voice recorder, you're only hearing the sound that's coming in through your ears. And that is actually how people hear you. So use a voice recorder. It's very informative. I can't tell you how much it changed the first time I heard myself give a presentation, and how after that I decided I really needed to work to improve my voice. The other thing you can do is practice, right? Practice modulating your voice. You can practice changing the speed of how you talk, the rhythm. You can talk about the duration of words, whether you want, words to hang around longer or shorter. You can pause during your presentation. When you pause, it gives what you just said some importance, some weight. People see that. And you can also work on your volume, right? Because when you increase in volume, people pay attention more as opposed to when you speak quietly. You can also work on your pitch and your tone. Pitch has to do with the frequency of your voice. Do you talk in a high voice or do you talk in a deep voice? And you can actually practice how you talk to change whether you want to speak in a high voice or a low voice. And when I've been working on this for many years, I normally have a much higher voice than this. Some might say girly, I don't know. But when I give presentations, I lower my voice because studies have shown that people that speak in a lower voice are portrayed as being more competent than people who speak in a high voice. The other thing that you can do is vary your tone. The tone is the emotional element in your voice. We all remember our mother saying to us as a kid, don't give me that tone, right? We know what she's talking about. An example of this is, he spoke in a nervous tone of voice. So you can work on your pitch and tone. Now, parents of children will know what I'm about to say. And speaking, to your children, reading them a children's book is actually a fantastic way to practice all of these qualities at the same time, right? So even just like with green eggs and ham, You know, you can read the book out loud. Do you like green eggs and ham? I do not like them, Sam, I am. I do not like green eggs and ham. Would you like them here or there? I would not like them here or there. I would not like them anywhere. See what I did? Just by talking and doing this children's book, I modulated my speed, my rhythm, my pitch, my volume, my tone. This will actually translate into when you give your scientific presentations, allowing you to be a better vocal presenter. You should also practice, and I can't emphasize this enough, although here I emphasize it 3 times. Practice is so important. Too often we go into presentations without practicing. Extroverts are particularly bad at this because extroverts feel like I can wing it, I can do fine. But you can't. Just trust me, you spend 15 minutes a day, not even 15 minutes a day, you just spend 15 minutes on your presentation and your presentation will go so much smoother because as you practice, you realize where breaks in your presentations are, where transition points kind of falter, and you also get a better sense of what you want to say about a slide. You don't want to be like the poor kid here on the left who has stage fright. You want to be like this confident woman here on the right. Because if you don't practice, it can lead to disasters. I mean, who can forget a couple years ago when Steve Harvey announced that Miss Columbia was the winner of the Miss Universe pageant? She was not the winner. He read the card wrong. He read the card wrong because he didn't feel like he needed to practice. Didn't feel like he needed to practice the finale. I can read a card, he said, and he didn't do it, and he screwed it up. And of course, who can forget just a few weeks ago when La La Land won Best Picture? Oh wait, that's right, they didn't. There was a screw up with the envelopes because they don't practice this. So practice, practice, practice. Stacy, now she's going to talk about technical issues and what you can do about them. Stacy? Stacy?
Oh, gosh, I'm so sorry. I was on mute. Actually, what we've been doing is monitoring the chat. So what I'm going to do is take a break here and talk about some of the questions that came up during the chat. First of all, Tim Bergma, Pete was riding a bear in that presentation. There were a couple, in that picture, there are a couple of questions about multitasking, and we're talking about using the tools, and a lot of the questions are, what is the risk of audience distraction with the tools? I would rather see somebody chatting or tweeting about the presentation and the content that they're listening to. To me, that means that they're engaged. Now, if they're starting to use the tools to be like, hey, dude, how was your weekend, and stuff like that, that's a different story. But if people are using the tools and they're thinking about things that are happening in the presentation and they're giving their feedback, to me that's a good kind of multitasking. You're not on your phone doing other things. You're still engaged in the presentation itself. Yes, it's true you may miss maybe some small components of the presentation, but to me I think having the chat on, and it would have been nice also, of course, if everybody could have seen it, but we'll work on that for the next one. I think that that's something that's really important. There was a nice comment that Jesse Jackson did the definitive reading of Green Eggs and Ham on Saturday Night Live, so we'll have to look that one up on YouTube. There was one question, Pete. I think these are for you. You mentioned about standing and you speaking from your diaphragm. So should face-to-face be done standing, and does it spoil the benefits of being a more informal presentation?
Yeah, I mean, standing doesn't work in every situation, right? If it's just you and your boss, standing while you give the presentation is just awkward. And even in core team meetings, it might be challenging to do it. I was thinking more along kind of what we're doing now, or maybe even when you're on your computer at a core team meeting and there's nobody else in the room, right? Standing up helps in that regard. So pick the right situation for it.
Yeah. And one more comment I want to make, and Mike Dodge asked the question, if the tools are frustrating, does the speaker own that? Yeah, I think they do, and I think that's why I said up front, is this going to work? I don't know. Might be distracting, might be a disaster. So I think you need to sort of be yourself and kind of get up there and say, you know what, let's try this and see if it works. So far, you can be the judge as to whether this works or not. Is it a little distracting? Maybe. But what's happening is I'm not multitasking. So while I'm talking to you, Pete's looking at the chat. And while he's talking, I'm looking at the chat. If you're by yourself, what you actually do is, because you said up front, we're going to use the chat to have a discussion today, you say, all right, guys, I'm going to take a second and I'm going to review the chat. So these are some things that you want to consider. I think I'll talk about, there were some questions about playing videos and live feed. I'll talk about that briefly. And maybe we come back to some of these in a few minutes. I'm looking at the chat, everyone.
Yeah. So the question came up, I don't make practicing talks a habit, do you? Yes, I do.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Every presentation I give. How much I practice, though, depends on how important the presentation is, right? If it's a core team presentation, I've done it a million times, I won't practice much. But, for something like this, I've practiced 10 or 15 minutes a day for the last 4 or 5 days.
Yeah.
And
Pete and I have practiced together as well.
Exactly. How do you know the balance between humor, non-related material to keep attention versus actual technical content to convey?
You want to come back to that maybe at the end?
Yeah,
we will come back to that question.
Okay, and then there was one other question about from a email. Let me get this in. Yeah. So how do you? Eva Hun, if I'm saying that right, how do you practice to speak in a low tone? I think it's especially challenging for women. Yes, it can be a challenge, but it can be done, right? If you go out to YouTube, there's a couple really nice videos of Margaret Thatcher before and after she had vocal training. Everybody kind of remembers her when she was prime minister in the 1980s, and she had this deep voice when she talked, but she wasn't always like that. And there's a couple very nice videos out there showing her speaking before she went to a vocal coach, and she actually learned how to lower her voice. I think it's really interesting. To me, it's really about practice, right? You've just got to practice it. Use your voice recorder and work on it.
Yep.
And if not, you can always hire a vocal coach. That if you're still not achieving what you think it should be. All right, Stacy's going to get back to the talk now.
Okay, and Joan, I'll cover hints for audience members to help continue to focus as we go through this. So I think what Pete's been talking about, coming back now to the presentation. So was that too distracting? Let's see at the end. Coming back to the presentation, Pete talked about human error in delivery, but I'm going to talk about human error in technology. So we've all been there. We were sharing our screen, and we were about to give our presentation, and oh gosh, excuse me, sorry, let me just close that. And anyway, as I was saying, so sometimes you're sharing your screen, and you have things that you want to tell people, and then, oh God, sorry, I forgot to close my instant messenger. Anyway, sorry. How do you avoid human error technology issues? Well, the best thing to do is share only the one program if possible. Now, normally what I would be doing is sharing only PowerPoint, but when I share PowerPoint, what happens is it shows both of my desktops. I have a dual desktop, so that's not something that we can do here, so I am sharing my screen. So if you are going to share your full monitor, make sure you're closing every program except the one that you're sharing. And if you're doing dual desktop, make sure you share the right one. I have been in presentations before where I was sharing my desktop and I accidentally shared the other desktop, which may have had something like Amazon or Facebook or Solitaire or something open on it. And make sure you clear off company IP or personal information in files before you do anything. Okay, so don't forget to turn off your phone. That's a big thing. We always forget to turn off our phones, and you've seen people do these presentations where all of a sudden their phone goes off in the middle. Do you want to tell your story? I just turned it off.
Oh, you turned off your phone.
Yeah,
okay.
About the guy on America's Got Talent.
Oh, yeah. So I don't know if you, this is just an anecdote I shared with Stacy this morning as we were talking about this presentation. I don't know if people watch America's Got Talent, but there was a couple of years ago, there was a guy on stage who was doing his actual presentation on stage and his phone went off. And he actually stopped, he picked up his phone and he said, no, I can't talk right now, I'm on America's Got Talent. I'll call you back later, bye. And that was not part of the act, that actually happened.
So in an effort to be transparent, we were going to do that here. I was going to have Pete call me, but we weren't queued up. So sometimes the technology does not always work. Anyway, some other human error technology issues. If you are going to be sharing an internet page, make sure you have the page already pulled up and all of your other tabs closed. You can see other tabs that might be up on my screen if you had given me a screen sharing without notice. And make sure you turn off all of your pop-ups. Close your instant messenger, close your chat, close your email, close your calendar, because those things tend to have pop-ups on your screen. I had a friend who was hosting a networking presentation, and I saw that he was on Instant Messenger. So I sent him a note like, hey, sweetie, how's your presentation going? And it popped up in front of the entire 60 people that were there. And they all insisted that he say hello to me, and he didn't, and I'm still a little hurt by that. But we've all done it. We've all had instant messages pop up that we really didn't want to be seen. And don't forget that you're sharing your desktop. So sometimes we'll share our desktop to give a presentation, and then we move on to other things. And I would like to apologize again to all of my colleagues at both Astellas and Novartis for watching me play solitaire on a number of occasions because I have forgotten that I was sharing my screen. So you know who you are, and I'm sorry again. But even if you do all of this right, there may still be technical issues that are beyond your control. So I was at a webinar the other day, and it was a bit of a mess, technology-wise. The speaker screens ended up going black while they were presenting. And there were huge delays in the slide advancement on their end, but not on ours. So they kept clicking the button to advance the slides, and their slides were flying by, but they didn't see them changing. And also we had somebody who was on voice over IP, and it kept cutting in and out. So these are things that there's not a lot you can do about them. For voice over IP, certainly consider calling on a landline, but sometimes technology issues occur. I've heard a couple of famous technology disasters. In 2005, Bill Gates was on the Conan O'Brien show to show something about Windows, and then Windows crashed. And at iPhone 4, Steve Jobs, during a presentation, couldn't get Wi-Fi, which, of course, he was trying to show that the phone gets Wi-Fi. So things can happen. One thing I found particularly interesting about webinars is that the audience may not see what you see. So there are a lot of tools that have a participant view window. So one of the webinars that I gave a couple months ago had a participant view window, and I actually watched that window as I gave the presentation. So you want to do that, or you want to have a partner log in as a participant during the practice run. See, Peter? Practice, practice, practice. So what do? We check whether our animations work smoothly or at all. Again, if you're uploading your presentation, your animations may not work. Check if there's a time lag. So in this presentation I did a couple of months ago, there was a lag between me clicking my mouse and the actual animation showing up or the slide advancing. So I had to change my pace accordingly. It also cut off the bottom about ½ inch of the screen. So you've got to make sure that the whole slide's content can be viewed and modify that ahead of time. Find out if they can see the tools like the chat, surveys, whiteboard, and annotations. And prior to this, we practiced with Suzanne and some of the people at Certara to make sure that they were able to use the chat and that we were able to see it. Somebody asked a question about choppiness of videos. That can happen, particularly if you have a lot of people that are taking up the bandwidth. Videos you need to be a little bit careful with. You can try to find sort of lower bandwidth videos. Oh yes, good point. Somebody wrote in the chat that it's a good time to make sure that scientific formulas render properly. We've probably all been at scientific presentations where they've gone to put up an equation and it looked very weird because it didn't render properly. So all of these things are very important to consider. Okay. So what do you do in terms of overcoming technology failure? Well, you have to understand the technology and practice using the webinar platform. So Pete talked about practicing your presentation. So we've done that just standing in my office with PowerPoint on. But you actually have to practice using the webinar platform so you can find out what the limitations are. And be prepared for problems. Problems will happen. You saw we couldn't figure out the phone thing, whatever. These things happen. Have a copy of your slide deck. Sometimes if, for whatever reason, you can't see your slides but the other people can, if you have a printed copy of your slide, or in our case we have a second laptop here, you want to have those available and also on a cloud or thumb drive so that you can actually get those up and running quickly. You want to make sure that everything is charged beforehand. I mean, that seems like a no-brainer, but people don't always think about these things. And if you're doing a demo, which I think is probably one of the bravest things that you could possibly do in a virtual meeting, especially an online demo, you know they're not going to work. So make sure you have screenshots of what you want to show in a PowerPoint. And when all else fails, laugh. Stuff happens. And I think that, you know, one of the things I mentioned before, and I think that Mike was asking, does the presenter own the tools if they don't work? Yeah, they do. But I think we just need to sort of be patient with each other and realize we're trying new things, you're trying new things, you know, and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, we're all going to move on, and people are going to clap for you at the end, presumably. We can't hear you. but, you know, I think that that's something to really consider. So, Pete, we've covered a lot. So why don't you give us a recap of the take-home messages for today while I look at the chat.
Thanks, Stacy. I'd be happy to do so. We have covered a lot. And if you've kind of not been paying attention during this webinar, if we haven't been able to keep your attention, and now because we're getting ready to close, your attention has kind of perked up again, I'd like to leave you with 4 points. So that if you leave here today and you don't remember anything about what we talked about except these 4 points, I think you will have gotten something from this. First of all, keep it interesting, right? Virtual presentations are a lot tougher than face-to-face presentations. They're more challenging to the presenter and they're more challenging to the audience. So you have to be more interesting than the distractions. You have to give an interesting presentation. Otherwise, people won't pay attention and you'll lose them. They won't be paying attention to what you have to say. Learn to use the tools. As Stacy talked about, a lot of these tools, WebEx, Adobe Connect, they've all got little nuances and things that you can do with them. If your company has one in particular, learn how to use it, right? Learn how to annotate a slide on the fly while within WebEx. Learn how to do it within PowerPoint. Take advantage of the tools. Too often, our virtual presentations are one way. It's like we're giving a slideshow projection where just the slides are changing. We don't have to do that. We can do other things. Annotate the slides. Put on some video next to it, right? All these WebEx presentations and stuff have a camera option where you can see the people that are there. Take advantage of it, right? If your company bandwidth will allow you to do it. So learn how to use the tools. And practice. I mean, I probably should have made this first. I mean, because to me, this is the most important thing for any presentation. Start practicing your presentations, right? Don't go in there and wing it and think, oh, I know what I'm going to talk about, because you don't. Because when you get in front of an audience, your adrenaline is starting to go, and when that happens, you've got almost this fight or flight reaction going on. It's hard to remember things. I mean, Stacy and I'll be honest, I fumbled a few times during this presentation. I was supposed to have opened up my phone and made a laugh track when Stacy gave her joke. I forgot to do it. We practiced it many, many times, but because of the stress of this situation of being live during this presentation, I fumbled. Even with all the practice, I fumbled. So clearly, I needed more practice. Practice, practice, practice. And lastly, don't forget you, right? It's not just about your slides. How you convey your information is as important, maybe even more important than your slides. I mean, a good presenter can take bad material and make it more interesting. But even if you've got great material, if you are a boring presenter, you are going to lose your audience, right? So don't forget you. Start becoming a better presenter yourself. And those are the 4 takeaway messages. Now, before we close for questions, I want to remind everybody, I hope you've been counting the number of cats in the presentation. So today, by let's say midnight tonight, you know, send us your estimate of the number of cats and your mailing address, and whoever comes closest to the actual number, we will send a copy of my book to them.
And Eva, you can count it as 1 or 2. We're going to give you the benefit of the doubt. You had a question as to when I showed that slide again, and the cat ran across again, did it count as 2? Let's say it counts as 2.
Okay, all right. And with that, we will now be open for any questions. Thank you.
Do you want to cover a couple of the chat points that came up about humor versus technical content and this one?
Oh, sure. Okay. Somebody had a question about the balance between humor and technical comment. Okay. Does humor have a role in a scientific presentation? I think it does, right? I mean, you're not going to go up there and you're not going to say 2 pharmacometricians walk into a bar. I mean, you're not going to make jokes like that. But I think it's easy to slip in a little bit of humor as you give your presentation. I told that horrible pun about that presentation being crappy, right? I don't see any problem with throwing something like that into a core team meeting. Actually, I think the people appreciate it, getting a little bit of levity in a presentation. You know, is it a stand-up act? No, it's not a stand-up act. You know, use it judiciously. and be very careful of the type of humor that you use. I mean, I'm very tempted today to make jokes about Donald Trump because everybody's doing it, but I'm going to refrain from doing that because I know I might offend people.
You've already done it, though.
I've probably already done it. But if I do make jokes, I tend to make jokes at my own expense, right? Because, you know, the only person that can be offended is me, and I don't get offended by it. I don't care. So, yeah, I think humor has a place. Use it judiciously, use it wisely, and in the right circumstances.
Yeah, and I think if you're presenting to the CEO of your company, that's when you maybe are a little more professional, a little less humorous. But I think particularly in virtual presentations where you got to keep people's energy high, throwing in a little bit of humor and a little bit of levity, I think, is just going to make people more interesting. And as several people said in the chat, if you're smiling, if you're humorous, and if you're cheerful, people are going to want to pay more attention. It makes a bad presentation, which this wasn't, of course, but it makes a bad presentation better, and it makes a good presentation great.
Yeah, and somebody asked the question, does interesting ever clash with professional? I hate that word professional. To me, professional means boring. But having said that, there are circumstances, as Stacy said, when you're presenting to the CEO where professional is needed. So hopefully that answers that question. What else do we got?
So there was another question from Jackson who wanted to know when he practices a presentation, he tries to drill down to the minimal amount of speaking, which are the key messages, and when live, he adds commentary because he knows the minimal structure path. What do you do? What I do, Jackson, so I think if I understand you correctly, Jackson, and type in the chat box if I don't, you're saying that when you practice the bare minimum. You practice your outline, and then you ad-lib a little bit or expand on it a little bit when you're giving your presentation. I think that's okay, but it also depends on how much time you have. I find that if you don't practice kind of what you want to say, you don't have to have a script, but if you don't practice what you want to say on each slide and really think out exactly what you're going to say on each slide, you have a tendency to meander, not you, but people have a tendency to meander off into other topics or take too much time. So I think if you have a very limited time frame in which you can do your presentation, you maybe want to practice a little bit more of actually what you're going to say during that. But if it's an informal presentation, you're sitting around with a group of people and you have time, I think that's okay. But I would say my recommendation would be to actually consider beefing up your practice to actually think about what you want to say on each slide. It'll keep you from fumbling too. Well, maybe. It doesn't always, but it can help.
Exactly. What if there's a tie for the exact number of cats?
How many books do we have?
I have a couple copies of my books. We'll see how many ties there are. If there's, maybe I'll take the top 5 or something like that.
We're assumed that all 300 and something people who logged in were actually paying close attention and we'll have the right number, in which case we'll have to figure that out.
Yeah.
So someone in our audience would like to know, do you recommend in a virtual presentation that your audience is quiet but with the mic open, or that everyone's on mute?
I prefer it on mute simply for the toiling flushing fiasco. I think with today's BlackBerry, headsets, it's so easy for people to walk around and do other things, and almost easy to forget that they're watching a presentation.
I've had the breathing people as well. If people are on their headset and you hear Darth Vader on the other end of the line. So one of the things that I've recently discovered is Adobe Connect, and I'm madly in love with it now because it actually has an opportunity for you to mute individual people, unmute individual people. People can give feedback like yes or no, or applaud, or please slow down, or please speed up, or please speak louder. To me, I used that the other day in a webinar, and what was so great about it is you can actually have breakout groups, and then the breakout groups can talk to each other and then come back to the main room. So it takes a lot of moderation. So, and I think in something like that, that's not something that one speaker can handle on their own. But if you did have a moderator, that's something that you could consider using. But I think to come back to the question, I think you want your audience muted, but maybe you want to give them the opportunity to unmute, or you unmute them rather than the other way around, so that they can ask questions.
What if at the end of your presentation you don't get any questions from the audience?
Plant them.
Yeah.
So that is one thing you can do, is plant them. Or you can have the other speaker who's with you ask you a question.
Yeah, but I think you also have to ask yourself why. You know, either you're a brilliant presenter and you've explained everything perfectly, or you've completely lost your audience and they don't know what questions to ask. So I like the idea about planting questions to get things going, but at the same time, I think you need to go to the root of the problem and try and figure out, you know, what happened with the questions. And sometimes the audience is just shy, and you just got to get them going, and that's what the planted questions do.
Yeah. Sometimes nobody wants to break the ice, so if you give the question to someone to ask, somebody will break the ice for you, and then other people will feel more comfortable. And we did have a comment that someone would accept a signed copy of You Riding the Bear in lieu of your book, so we could consider that as well if we have a tie.
All right.
Looks like we have one final question from our audience. What can you do to help improve your voice if you have an accent because English isn't your native language?
Yeah, accents are tough, but only when you're not in the country of the accent, right? Because, you know, when you're speaking to people with the same accent, it's easy to understand, but I think it's important for people to realize, and a lot of times, I'm not sure people really think about it, is that, you know, people may not really understand you. And so with people with accents, you know, my recommendation is to practice and practice slower.
Yes.
Right? You're going to have to talk slower than what you normally talk. And there are things that you're going to have to repeat. You may have to say things, you know, the same thing, but maybe in different ways so that people can understand you. And if you do have a thick accent, at the very least, because we are scientists and we deal with numbers, really try to learn to pronunciate the numbers without the accent so that numbers are at least understood. That would be my recommendation.
Yeah.
Of course, live audience too. You know, do your presentation with an audience and see where your, you know, where stumble points might be.
Yeah, in fact, we have a number of Japanese expats that are here in our Northbrook office, and I have recommended to some of our friends who are going to Japan, practice your presentation with them and let them give you some feedback in terms of your speed and your tone and whether or not you have colloquialisms, you know, jokes that maybe they won't understand or comments that they won't understand in there. I think it's, you know, if you can practice with people who are of that culture of another language, I think that's also very helpful to get you feedback ahead of time. So it all comes back to practicing.
Thanks so much, Pete and Stacy. Before we conclude the webinar,